The space above Orion looked like a sea of stars in convulsion. Where once there had been silence and peaceful trade routes, there was now a living, flaming, and unpredictable battlefield. Human cruisers advanced in disorganized formations, trying to hold off the advance of Kareth ships, huge, covered in organic structures, resembling living creatures gliding through the void. The war had reached its climax, and everything converged on a single point: the orbital station, Flame of Orion. This station was not just any base. Built centuries ago, it was a monument of interspecies cooperation, a fortress of peace in the heart of the galaxy. But peace had become only a distant memory. The human alliance, cornered and with no alternatives, used the station as their last defensive bastion. If it fell, the Kareth would have direct control over the star channels, ancient gravitational routes that allowed for rapid travel between entire systems. With this power, no world would be safe. The scene was dense, almost suffocating. Ships exploded silently, releasing flashes of light that looked like gloomy fireworks. Metal fragments floated like cosmic dust. The space between Orion and the enemy fleets was littered with incandescent wreckage, frozen bodies, and wandering escape pods. There was no heroic music. There were no inspiring speeches. There was only the dull sound of interrupted communications, the shrill alarms echoing through the station corridors, and the silent roar of explosions spreading through the void. Inside the station, the runners vibrated with each distant impact. Officers ran from one side to the other, trying to keep the defense active. The chain of command had been partially shattered after the last Kareth attack. A bioplasmic missile had pierced shields and hit core systems, leaving entire sectors in the dark. Now, only fragmented transmissions reached the command center. The human fleet fought blindly. Meanwhile, the Kareth forces were advancing with precision. Their ships resembled aquatic organisms. They had flexible hulls and lived in symbiosis with their crews. Instead of conventional engines, they pulsed like hearts, releasing gravitational waves that propelled them forward. Their beams of energy cut through human defenses like glowing blades piercing thin glass. They didn't just want to destroy the station. They wanted to take it intact. They knew that at its core was something more valuable than any fleet, an ancient system predating human expansion itself, capable of manipulating the shipping lanes of the entire galaxy. Every minute of resistance meant more deaths. Each explosion, another lost sector. The station's automated defenses were operating in emergency mode. Repair drones tried, futilely, to weld destroyed corridors while electrical fires danced in the shadows. And it was in this scenario that fate began to move silently. In one of the side hangars, far from command, a small maintenance craft was stuck between alarms and darkness. In it, a single human pilot, someone with no leadership post, no weapons, and no glory, watched the sky ablaze, unaware that he would be dragged into the center of this war. The battle for Orion was not just another confrontation, it was the final line between civilization and domination. And above that station, surrounded by fire and silence, the entire universe watched the last human stand unfold. On the lower levels of the station, away from the command rooms and corridors where officers shouted frantic orders, a small maintenance craft was attached to a nearly empty side hangar. It was a simple, aging ship, with peeling paint and engines that creaked when started. Inside, Ethan Hale, a space maintenance technician, watched the warning lights flash steady red. He did not wear a combat uniform, nor did he carry sophisticated weapons. He wore the same grease-stained jumpsuit as always, a silent symbol that he was someone who fixed things, not someone who fought wars. Ethan should have evacuated hours earlier. Withdrawal notices were sent to all sectors when the station's shields began to give way. But he stayed. First, because he believed that he would be able to reconnect the communication systems, isolated by a breakdown. Second, because the evacuation turned into chaos. Finally, because when he tried to leave, it was too late. The corridors were destroyed, the escape routes blocked, and the Kareth fleet was already encircling the entire region. From the seat of the ship, he looked into space through the panoramic viewfinder. What he saw was difficult to process. The sky was filled with flashes, explosions, and energy trails. It looked like an ocean on fire. The human ships slowly retreated, one after the other being shot down. On the other side, the Kareth formations advanced like a living wall. It was clear the Alliance was losing. Ethan took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He always imagined that he would die of old age on some outlying station, or perhaps in a maintenance accident, not in the midst of an interstellar war. He was not a hero. I never wanted to be. The war was a matter for generals, strategists, and fighter pilots. His role has always been to tighten screws, repair antennas, and keep systems running so that others shine. But at that moment, there was no one else in that hangar. No commander to give orders. No squad to protect the station. No reinforcement coming from hyperspace. Just him, his old ship, and a sky that seemed to disintegrate outside. A bang shook the structure. Dust fell from the ceiling. Ethan stood, staggering to the side panel. The sensors showed that a nearby sector had been hit by a Kareth torpedo. The impact had severed the main power line that fed the long-range transmitters. If it wasn't fixed, no one would hear the station's cries for help. No reinforcement fleet would know what was happening. He looked out into the dark corridors of the hangar, and then into the ship's dashboard. He knew that, technically, he could hide there and wait for the end. But he also knew that if he did nothing, all that effort would be useless. The station would fall, the routes would be taken, and millions would die without even knowing what happened. Ethan took another deep breath. Damn, I don't believe I'm going to do that. He sat down in the pilot's seat and started the engines, and the ship vibrated with difficulty. There was no heroism in his gaze. There was fear, there was doubt, but there was also a quiet sense of responsibility. The kind that comes when no one else is there to act. Outside, the sky was at war. Inside, an ordinary man had just taken the first step to change her course. The maintenance craft inched its way through the station's internal pressurized tunnels, guided by forward searchlights that cut through the darkness like spears of light. Ethan kept his hands firmly in control, dodging debris, hanging cables, and partially collapsed walls. The alarms sounded intermittently, as if the structure itself was crying for help. Each turn seemed quieter than the last. The sectors were abandoned, and he had the strange feeling of moving through a dying body. The destination was clear, the communications core. If it were able to re-establish the long-range transmitters, it might still be possible to send a request for reinforcement. Perhaps some Alliance fleet was nearby, ready to jump to the aid. But deep down, Ethan knew it was a fragile hope. Almost naive. As it approached the plant, the craft shuddered. Panels flashed erratically. The system began to pick up a weak signal, a hidden transmission, buried deep in the oldest layers of the database. It was as if an ancient echo had been awakened by chance. Ethan frowned, adjusting the manual frequencies, something no automated pilot would have done. The noise was intense, full of static, until slowly a distorted voice emerged. Protocol, Orion, last defense, sealed key, central chamber, protect the flame. The message repeated itself in a short, old, broken loop like a warning left by someone long dead. Ethan turned up the volume and felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never heard anything about an Orion protocol in his years of technical service. This was not in any manual, in any maintenance meeting, or in any official broadcast. It was something hidden, curious and restless. He opened the archives of the station's ancient architecture. It took a few seconds to find a schematic diagram, digitally dusty, dating back more than 200 years. And there it was. A central area with no registered access, locked by forgotten codes. In the center, a symbol he had never seen before. A stylized flame, engraved in gold. The penny dropped, little by little. The station had been built not only as an observation post or trading point, but also as a vault. And inside that vault was something called the Last Flame. He reread the old message several times. The words were clear. Last defense, sealed key, protect the flame. It was evident that the Kareth knew of the existence of this protocol. After all, they were attacking with almost surgical precision, heading straight for the main cores. They weren't trying to destroy the station. They were trying to take it. And if that artifact or technology fell into enemy hands, it wouldn't just be Orion that would fall. The entire galaxy would be vulnerable. Ethan leaned back in his seat for a moment, He could ignore that. I could keep trying to send out calls for help and hope someone would arrive on time. But there was another truth pulsating within him. No one else knew the message. No one else was there to follow her. If he wasn't, no one would. He activated the internal thrusters again and changed course. Now, the goal was no longer to repair antennas. It was to get to that forgotten chamber before the Kareth. The entire station was falling apart. Time was short, and in the depths of the void, an old echo had just chosen a new listener. The corridors leading to the central core of the station were like a dark, broken labyrinth. The emergency lights flickered, casting flickering shadows across the destroyed walls. The air was dense, full of metallic dust and the smell of burnt cables. Ethan parked the maintenance ship at one of the inner docks and proceeded on foot, carrying only a magnetic flashlight, his toolkit, and a small portable generator. Each step echoed as if he were walking inside an abandoned cathedral, where the war had replaced silence with constant suspense. The holographic map projected on his wrist flickered with intermittent glitches. Several sections were blocked, others were completely destroyed. Ethan had to improvise routes, passing through maintenance areas that no one had used in decades. As he advanced, he could hear metallic noises reverberating in the distance. The Kareth had already penetrated the station. They were fast and methodical. A distant explosion shook the surrounding structures. Fragments fell from the ceiling. Ethan bent down instinctively, feeling his heart race. He knew he couldn't afford to hesitate. Every second lost meant more territory conquered by the invaders. And the further they advanced, the less chance he had of reaching the mysterious chamber where the last flame was hidden first. In one of the narrow corridors, he passed through a broken panoramic window, protected by a temporary containment field. Outside, space was still at war. The human fleet, visibly weakened, tried to hold the edges of the sector. The Kareth ships moved forward as an organized swarm, and the station was the central target. The sight was terrifying, but it also served as a reminder. If he failed, there would be no second chance. Turning the next corner, Ethan heard a sound closer, heavy rhythmic footsteps, like boots pounding against metal. He immediately turned off his flashlight and hid behind a ruptured pipe. 3 Kareth soldiers appeared in the hallway, tall, bluish-skinned, and in living armor that moved subtly, breathing with them. They carried curved weapons that seemed to be fused to their own arms. They didn't speak. They moved like hunters who already knew that their prey was somewhere nearby. Ethan held his breath. The invaders stopped for a moment, as if they felt something in the air. One of them turned in the direction where he was hiding. For a second, everything was suspended, until an alarm sounded from another sector. They moved quickly there, disappearing down the hallway. Ethan waited a few seconds before leaving, his heart pounding in his chest. The next path was partially blocked by an earlier explosion. He had to use the portable generator to temporarily reactivate the access gates. Sparks exploded as the old circuits came back to life and the doors opened with a sharp, shuffling sound. On the other side, a spiral staircase led to the central core of the station. Ethan ran. The lights flickered, the ground shook with each new impact from outside, and guttural voices echoed in the distance. The Kareth were spreading. It was a silent race between one man and one empire. And at that moment, every meter he conquered was a spark of hope in the midst of darkness. The spiral staircase led to an old corridor. Unlike any other sector of the station, the walls were clad in an aged golden metal, covered in inscriptions that Ethan had never seen before. The lighting did not come from ordinary lamps, but from threads of light embedded in the material itself. As if the structure were alive and aware of someone's presence. The air there was strange, almost too quiet. There were no alarms. There were no echoes of war. It was like entering a place that time had forgotten. At the end of the corridor, a circular door blocked the way. Unlike the others, it did not have a modern digital panel, just a cavity in the shape of a hand. Ethan approached cautiously, hesitating. When he positioned his palm, a light ran down the wall and ran down the frame of the door, which opened with a low crack, releasing an intense golden glow from inside the room. The central chamber was vast and perfectly spherical, as if it had been built by a civilization with a different understanding of architecture. In the center, suspended by a silent gravitational field, floated a golden crystal. It pulsed slowly, like a sleeping heart, radiating soft light that reflected off thousands of metal fragments on the ceiling. Concentric rings floated around the crystal, rotating at different speeds, producing a harmonic, almost musical sound. Ethan was paralyzed by the scene. It didn't look like human technology, and maybe not even Kareth. It was older, more precise, more alive. He took a few hesitant steps, taking in the symbols on the walls. Most were dimmed, but some began to light up as he approached the crystal. A gentle vibration ran through the floor, and the rings accelerated their rotation. The crystal reacted to his presence, as if it recognized him. Ethan reached out slowly. As his fingers touched the edge of the gravitational field, a wave of energy raced through the room. The light increased in intensity, filling every corner. Echoes of ancient voices, in languages he didn't understand, reverberated within his mind. It was as if memories trapped in that place were awakening. The entire station responded to the ringing. He felt vibrations coming from the floor, and distant alarms changed their tone. Outside, Kareth's sensors began to register a sudden surge in energy, immediately locating the source, the chamber of the last flame. Ethan realized that he had activated something, but I didn't know exactly what. On the ground, a platform slowly emerged, revealing a primitive interface composed of geometric holograms. Even without understanding the language, he understood the essential. There was a dormant mechanism ready to be activated, a last resort of defense. He took a deep breath. The responsibility fell on his shoulders with a silent weight. He was not a soldier, but he was facing a weapon that could decide the fate of millions. Abroad, the war intensified. Inside, an ancient flame was awakening, waiting for someone, anyone, to rekindle it. Then, not knowing exactly what would come, Ethan put his hand on the platform. The holograms exploded into golden light, and the station shook as if a colossal creature had awakened from a deep slumber. The last flame. She was alive again. The reverent silence of the chamber was torn by a deep metallic sound, a dry impact, like claws slamming against steel. Ethan turned sharply. The circular door, which had previously seemed solid and impenetrable, began to deform from within, as if a colossal force was crushing it. The golden crystal continued to pulse, but now emitted a higher frequency, as if it were sensing the threat approaching. Ethan stepped back a few steps, his heart racing. He knew what was coming next. The Kareth had located the power source. It would not be long before the first soldiers invaded the place. With a deafening crash, the door exploded inward, hurling metal fragments down the hallway. 3 Kareth warriors entered with military precision, advancing in formation. They were tall, with bluish skin and living armor that molded itself to the bodies, breathing with them. His curved weapons glowed greenish, and his eyes pulsed with an almost fanatical light. They weren't looters, they were executors of a sacred mission, to capture the last flame intact. Ethan threw himself behind a metal column next to the platform, breathing fast. He had no weapons. I had no training. The toolkit he was carrying seemed ridiculously useless in front of those figures, but he knew that station better than any invader, and that, at that moment, was the only real advantage he had. The Kareth spread out across the room, checking the crystal, activating sensors embedded in the armor. One of them walked directly towards the activation console. Ethan realized that if he let that happen, everything would be lost in seconds. He needed to act, even if he didn't have time to think. He crawled to a nearby auxiliary power box. The cables were exposed, sparking lightly. With trembling hands, he quickly adjusted the portable generator he brought with him and overloaded the circuits. A growing hum filled the room. And then, an electrical explosion ran through the ground like a serpent of light. 2 Kareth were hit squarely, their organic shields writhing before collapsing. They fell, smoldering on the metal floor. The third warrior roared in his guttural tongue and ran towards the column where Ethan was hiding. The speed was frightening. Ethan barely had time to dodge. The creature's energetic blade cut through part of the wall, sending sparks into the air. He stumbled backwards, hitting the stairs, trying to reach for anything he could use as a defense. It was then that the crystal reacted. A wave of golden light emanated from him, expanding like a living pulse. The Kareth warrior was hit mid-jump. For a brief second, it was suspended in the air, and then was hurled violently against the curved wall of the chamber, leaving a glowing trail on impact. The silence returned, broken only by Ethan's panting. The bodies of the invaders lay on the ground, and the crystal continued to glow, now with constant intensity. It was as if he had recognized the threat and responded on his own. Ethan leaned on the platform, trembling but lucid. The Kareth wouldn't just send a squad. That had been an initial breakthrough, a recognition. The bulk of the forces would follow, and he knew he wouldn't have another chance. If you wanted to protect the Last Flame, I would have to decide soon what to do with it. The fate of the war had just entered the countdown. Ethan rested his hands on the platform, trying to catch his breath. The room smelled of ozone and burnt metal. The bodies of the Kareth still smoked on the floor, and the golden crystal pulsed with a steady frequency, as if silently awaiting the next command. Outside, the muffled sound of explosions increased. The room's sensors indicated intense movements in several nearby corridors. The invaders were approaching en masse. He knew he didn't have much time. When looking at the platform's holographic console, he noticed that new icons had lit up. Even without understanding the ancient language, the meaning was almost instinctive. Two main options shone before him. One, marked in blue, seemed to keep the crystal on hold, perhaps for delivery or transport. The other, in intense gold, showed a long sequence and a countdown that would only start when he confirmed it. It was a shot, an activation, something big. Ethan remembered the old transmissions he had heard in the communications center. Last defense, protect the flame. That was not a simple source of energy. It was a weapon, or at least a mechanism designed to turn the tide of an entire war. But what exactly would happen? He didn't know. For a moment, doubt paralyzed him. He was not a commander. He was not a strategist. He had never been trained in decisions that defined the fate of star systems. His job has always been to follow orders. Now there was no one to call the shots. Only him, alone, in the face of a power that surpassed anything he had ever imagined touching. A new explosion echoed very close. The hallway lights flickered. The ground shook. The Kareth was almost reaching the chamber. Ethan looked at the outside indicators. Dozens of enemy signals approaching. Outside, space was taken over by enemy ships, ready to completely break through human defenses. If the station were captured, they would have unfettered access to the star routes. Whole worlds would fall. He swallowed. If I make a mistake, I can destroy everything. He paused. If I don't do anything, they're going to win anyway. The inner voice that always told him to stay in the background, to let the heroes act, was silent. Because at that moment, there were no heroes. There was only him. With trembling hands, Ethan touched the golden command. The crystal reacted immediately, releasing beams of light that intertwined in the air, forming complex patterns. The countdown has begun. 60 seconds. Old alarms, from a system no one had used for centuries, echoed throughout the station. Doors sealed automatically. Energy barriers have been activated. It was as if a sleeping machine had awakened with unrelenting clarity. He looked at the maintenance ship parked in the hallway, the only possible escape route. I could try to run, but he knew that the Last Flame's activation radius would encompass the entire station. There would be no survivors inside. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to the crystal. All right, so let's go all the way. As the count went down, he slowly walked to the center of the room, watching the golden glow intensify. The beating of the crystal synchronized with his heart, as if the structure itself accepted him as part of the process. Outside, the Kareth ships lined up for the final assault. Inside, an ordinary man had made his choice. The countdown echoed through the chamber like an old clock marking the last beats of a colossal heart. Each number seemed to vibrate through the floor and walls, blending with the distant sound of explosions outside. Ethan remained motionless in front of the crystal, watching the golden ring spin faster, emitting a light so intense that it began to fill every corner of the room. 10, 9, 8. In the corridors, dozens of Kareth soldiers rushed toward the core. The living armor fluttered with energy. They knew they were close to victory. Taking the Last Flame meant rewriting the map of the galaxy. No one could stop the advance of the Empire, but what they didn't know It was already too late. 5, 4. Outside, the Kareth fleets lined up for the final blow. Gigantic cruisers carried their main guns, aimed at the last human ships that held out on the edges of the sector. The Alliance fleet was on the verge of collapse. Distorted communicators echoed desperate cries, broken orders, and evacuation calls. Everyone believed that Orion would fall. 3, 2. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, all the noise seemed to disappear. He remembered who he was, a technician, an ordinary man, someone who slipped unnoticed in the hallways. I never wanted glory. He never imagined being remembered. But there, in the center of that old chamber, the fate of millions rested on a decision that no one else had the courage or opportunity to make. 1. The entire station lit up with a golden glow. The crystal released a wave of silent energy, expanding in all directions like the rising of a sun within the void. The light passed through the walls, corridors, and naves, spreading into the open space in a matter of seconds. Outside, the Kareth ships began to fail, one by one. Gravity engines shut down, guns froze mid-firing, and shields collapsed. The giant cruisers were left adrift, powerless in the face of a force they did not understand. The human officers, stunned, watched the command panels flash with messages that seemed impossible. The entire enemy fleet had been neutralized. At the station, the light reached its peak. The entire structure shook violently, as if it was taking its last breath. Ethan looked around, feeling the golden heat envelop him. There was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet calm, and one certainty: he had made the right choice. The flame of Orion then exploded, releasing a last burst of light that could be seen from neighboring systems. When the flash disappeared, the battlefield was quiet. The human ships floated between disconnected enemy giants. The war was not over, but an improbable victory had just changed its course forever. In official records, no one found survivors at the station. Only residual signs of the flame's activation and metallic fragments scattered throughout the void. But the name Ethan Hale would be etched in history not as that of a soldier, but as that of the common man who rekindled the last light when all seemed lost. If you like epic sci-fi stories, where a single act can change the fate of civilizations, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. The next battle in the stars can start when you least expect it.